So, you know this book? This is the second most published book in the world after the Bible. As many almost copies as the Quran is published. So, the first time in its history, Armenia got in the Guinness Book of World Record thanks to our shoe that we found here. Oldest leather shoe, and it's like at the very beginning of the whole set of the book, the Guinness Book of Records.
Do we get closer here?
And then the Italians took over.
The shoe actually the shoe got more even more famous because it both the winery and the shoe we arranged it that it all went through first National Geographic, and the National Geographic has an amazing network. So before even publishing in National Geographic, we used that network to advertise these discoveries. And the point for the show was when Manolo Blochnik went to the interview with David Letterman. And then they started discussing this show, besides all other things. And so within a week, we had the most hits on the web than ever any kind of Armenian event or things, even, sorry to say that, more than the Armenian genocide. We had in 2 weeks 2 billion hits.
Wow.
More than Kardashian?
More than Kardashian, yes. Because of the show, more than Kardashian, yes, exactly. So we have this. This was a great news for us.
Where was it found?
I'm going to tell you everything.
Okay.
When there is a lot of issues related to warfare or military confrontation, it promotes also scientific development. We know that in technology and other things. So in the middle of 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, the Ministry of Defense of the Soviet Union, which was very much concerned about the possible nuclear attack from the United States, issued an order and a big funding to document all the existing caves across the Soviet Union that where potentially either goods can be hidden in case of nuclear attack, or people could be hidden further from the areas of nuclear explosions and so on. And essentially in Armenia, because they knew that there are many caves, the project to document all the caves the contract was given to the Armenian Geographic Society, led by the president was one of the professors of our university, Solomon Balyan, and a number of other geologists and geographers. And at that time, I essentially just was out of my PhD from St. Petersburg. They hired me to take a look at caves where they are finding some kind of traces of human activities. So obviously I did not participate to all their research, but I had about 20 visits to the places where they were finding remains. So in total, almost 3,000 caves were documented. Some of them with traces of human activities, others without traces. Balyan also asked me to visit this place. Here, I had no idea what is here. There were few pieces of medieval pottery. And
medieval what?
Pottery.
Pottery.
And there were few obsidian shards. One was looking like a Middle Paleolithic Mousterian flake on the slope over there. So in that report, we wrote a small paragraph that there was a human occupation. And I forgot about this completely. I knew that it's probably a very interesting archaeological place, but it was not the true discovery. It was the time when the cave first became known. The true discovery started later, when essentially, and it was triggered by a big explosion of search in the Old Stone Age, Old Paleolithic, which was essentially started from the moment when on the border between Georgia and Armenia in the early 90s, in the Manisi, suddenly very well preserved remains of hominids, of Homo erectus, the ancestor, that was thought to come out of Africa and inhabit the rest of the world, probably around different dates, like in Israeli archaeologists were saying 1.2 million years before present, the others 1.1 million years, because the oldest, at the beginning of the 90s, the oldest remains of the Homo erectus from Kenya, from South Africa, and so on, they were dated about 1.5 million years ago. So the finds in the Manisi, first of all, they are in exceptionally great condition. There are 3 or 4 almost complete skeletons. And the most important, the most intriguing, that by the beginning of 2000s, a number of and they were all also under the basalt deposits, rock deposits. So they were able to obtain dates with the argon potassium radio analysis, isotopic analysis. What came out that that Homo erectus dates by almost 1.7, 1.8 million years before present, approximately 300,000 years older than the specimens known from Africa. So, and this triggered essentially an explosive interest in the Paleolithic, not only in Georgia and in Armenia. And by that time, archaeology was in a very bad shape. The only way that archaeology could survive compared to other institutes was through international cooperations. That was started already in the 1980s, the moment that the borders got loosened a little bit and people were able to do collaborative work. But through that collaborative work, archaeology in Armenia survived better than any other field of the social sciences and the humanities. So, and today we have like, the Institute of Archaeology has like 13 or 14 projects with foreign expeditions, with foreign institutions, universities, institutions, with Germany, France, England, the United States, Russia, and so on, which allowed for survival of this. And obviously the first, and by that time we were actually left with only one scholar, my friend and co-director on this project, Boris Gasparian, who essentially was very actively engaged in this search for the oldest human remains of the Paleolithic. So they started working in the Razdan Gorge. Now they also work in northern Armenia, in the region of Sisyan. So, and very fantastic, great discoveries, great finds. But they also were interested in exploring this region. So Boris and his collaborators from the University of Connecticut started surveying this part, mostly caves that were already known on the list of those geological exploration of cave surveys, because the general list still existed. And essentially they obviously came to this Areni 1 cave, looked what is inside, and there was no much expectation, because still they came back to the idea that there is something medieval here, which I'm going also to show you, this very surface faint remains, medieval remains. So they assigned to make a small trench inside. It was 2007, to one of my former students when I was still in the 80s, not in the United States, but here in teaching, Firdous Muradyan, archaeologist, who was mostly excavating Bronze Age, and since the group of Paleolithic scholars were not yet very much interested in this, to dig just a very small test pit. And I am excavating with my co-director Aram Kalantarian at Dvin. At the time, the capital of medieval Armenia, and so on and so forth. So about 3 days after the beginning of the excavations, the director of the Institute of Archaeology and Boris, they call me, I am at Dvin, and they are saying, Gregory Firdus is finding some crazy things in this Areni 1 cave. Like they find pieces of clothing, they find vines, dried vines, they find dry fruit, they found almost a completely dried chicken. Probably they said something, this is very late, but interesting is that there is a very strange pottery with it. So practically the part of Paleolithic archaeologists from abroad, they were not very much interested. After the 2007, they left the work here, and Boris stayed here, and I joined him essentially. So the first time I'm coming here, and they are saying, what the junk is here? And showing. And I'm looking at this pottery, I'm saying this pottery is really quite old. Because before that, for me, quite old is 7,000-8,000 years. To people who are studying the Old Stone Age, it's yesterday, because they are interested in the origins of humankind and so on and so forth. So although I've done one small Paleolithic survey, but never in my academic career, by now I published 170 works I have published. I have only one related to the Paleolithic period. Everything else is after the Holocene, our geological period, for the last 10,000 years. So for me, this Copper Age looking pottery is very old. It's older than medieval, older than ancient Near Eastern Assyrian Empire and so on. It's older than the Bronze Age, so it's quite interesting. So I said, and I have beautiful photographs, I need to publish them one day. The very first day of excavations, where this is all flat, and Boris and I will stand here at the moment of when we are putting the squares in this part. So essentially, most of the excavations were done jointly by the Institute of Archaeology of Armenia and UCLA, with the participation also of the Cork University of Ireland, where our Ron Pinchasi was our paleobiological archaeologist. Yeah, this is also called by the locals the bird's cave.
No, we saw. I've been monitoring this movement. It's a snake.
Yeah, that could be.
It's a big snake.
So the snake goes up and
Yeah, it climbs toward the nest.
Is there a real snake? Yeah. Can you see it down?
There's a group of four nests on the left-hand side here, and it's right on the bottom right.
So let us continue. So most of the excavations were carried out in 4 years, from 2007 to 2011, and a little bit in 2012. And right now we are mostly working on the publication of the materials because we have an enormous amount of data. We have here 5 different trenches. You will see trench number 1 and 2 inside. This was our trench number 3. We have trenches number 4 and 5 outside. The general thing is that, okay, let me talk a little bit about the latest layers and stratigraphy, because later inside we are going to talk about the part of the most cool stuff, the winery. So, what you can see here, you can see this enormous rock. And this is a very important rock, because it fell underneath. Underneath you can see also remains of ashes. And we dated those ashes, these ashes with the isotopic radiocarbon date. These ashes date to about 3,500, 3,400. So if you look here, you can see that pit. This is the only place where we have reached the bedrock outside, because inside it's much, much deeper. And when we are consulting geologists, they know very well the formation of these karstic caves. And most of those karstic caves look like a pear if you cut it, a section of a pear. So you have a little bit rounding top, then you have like a bottleneck, and gradually it grows and expands at the bottom. So according to their calculations, the top to bottom height inside the cave should be something between 12 and 15 meters. And we did not reach the bottom. We are very far away from the bottom, you will now see. Now, this is a very interesting place. Why? Because on top, you see this exactly 13th century medieval bread baking tonneau or oven with the pipe. But what is more interesting, by its side, you see it cut in and it cut into that big jar, gray jar by the side, and that gray jar is already Copper Age, last phase of Copper Age, 3600 BC. So this is when we are talking about not only geological but archaeological sequence of layer stratigraphy. This is how it looks. You can have like this jar tonneau inserted underneath the surface of the earth. You can see the surface before the excavation, so it was all excavated. But in its time, in the 13th century, it was dug into the remains of the Copper Age. And you can see the jar by that side, in situ, not touched, of the Copper Age. Whatever you see here, absolutely no shovels were used, no pickaxes, nothing. It was all either trowels or inside mostly brushes, because it's all filled and composed of dust inside. So you have to brush out all these things. Whole formation of the cave, two more features. First of all, look up, and you will see black traces, all black.
Yeah.
Mostly, it's essentially the poos of the bats.
Oh, the poop of the bats.
The mummy, yes, mummy.
Okay.
They call this very like healing material used by different folk medicines, and also obviously some just traces of smoke and ashes coming from the very late fires that were lit here inside. The other interesting thing, if you look into that corner, this was the first days of excavation. In that part, we went down another 4 meters. And in that, we still didn't hit the bedrock. But at the depth of 4 meters, we collected charcoal that was dating back to 6,300 BC, which means 8,300. So there was a continuous usage of the cave. And the interesting thing is, when you look very carefully at that place where you see the bags filled with sand, so that just people don't go and it doesn't collapse, we are putting. Inside, it looks like that part is an arch where the humans have expanded it to go further, so we may have another gallery going from there. And there could be some very interesting stuff, judging from what we found here. So in this part, we have these 3 layers of the Chalcolithic dating from 4,200 BC, 6,200 before present, all the way to 3,000, not as late as in the front, up to 3,800. It doesn't get later. Maybe even 3,900 is the latest top level. Now, if you look on the section of that part of the trench, because these are artificial, we've excavated just one part. We are standing on the parts that you will, if you excavate underneath your feet, you will find the continuation of this thing. Yes. So on that section, you see that white layer on top. And this white layer, I don't know if you would guess it, what it is. It is compacted sheep dung. Yes. And it was this sheep dung that together with the steady temperatures in the cave that fluctuate from this temperature to normal. This is the regular summer temperature. In the winter, it will fall maybe down by only 5 or 6 degrees. So the steady temperature and the fact that this dung was compacted by ships coming and coming and coming created a totally anaerobic condition with no air underneath. So it's like all what was underneath was like sealed under concrete by this ship dung. And this is the only place that we have to break that layer, not only with pickaxes, sometimes even with hammers.
Wow.
And then when you break that about 15 centimeters layer, you immediately get into the layer of dust that is covering all these remains from 3,900 years BC, almost 6,000 years before present, and earlier. So most of the preservation in this cave is due to these main factors: steady temperature, absence of humidity, and sealing by this former ship dung that became concrete. So
That was fortunate.
that was very fortunate, and that's why, because this is the place where we have all of the Caucasus and the adjacent parts of all the Middle East, except for Israel, where we also, and probably Palestine, where we also have such similar kinds of caves. A little bit of a later period, like only by 200 years later, where you have also an excellent preservation of organic material. Because here we found pieces, artifacts made of wood, pieces of clothes, reed mats, leather, and so on, which is the wonderful stuff that we never find during archaeological excavations. Things that don't survive more than 200-300 years, usually. You need to go to ancient also Egypt, to the Old Kingdom, when you have similar things dated back about 2,800 years BC and later, because of these absolutely fantastic preservations in pyramids, and mostly in their caves, in their burial chambers, like of the pharaohs of the, yes, because of stability. So, what do you see here? You see the following. You see those wooden sticks. Actually, those wooden sticks are dated 3,900 BC. So, and they are, you see, they are preserved like fresh wood. That was the place where there, as I said, Firdous Murajan was digging and getting out chickens and other things. Very fresh. So, we think that these sticks were used just as torches to illuminate the entire inside when they used these four ceremonies. The other important thing is, and a lower level below that, that's 3,900 BC. We have this thing, and this is the wine pressing installation. Yeah. This is the wine pressing installation, which is composed of two main features. The central, the round, is the vat, where the juice was flowing, and this round with elevated edges like a platform. It's the basin where you could dump approximately up to 100-150 kilograms of grapes and just pressure them, and the juice were flowing into the vat.
So from here to there?
Yes, from here to there. So this is essentially now about the potentiality for the study of the wine. Carbon dated, this is exactly 4,000. 4,000 BC, 6,000 years before present. Now, what is, this is the beginning of the late copper age, late Chalcolithic, beginning, very beginning. Now, the interesting thing is that both in Georgia and in Armenia, we found, both in Georgia and in Armenia, in this our earliest settlements dating back 8,000 years, we already find grape seeds, but we don't know really whether those are cultivated or not. The fact that, or whether they made wine or not. But the fact is that 8,000 years before present, they were already collecting those grapes. most likely those were just wild grapes, because the whole environment of agriculture that we find in those earliest settlements of the New Stone Age, it's pretty much only cultivation of wheat and barley and like seasonal things, because grape cultivation requires a much more complex technology. So pretty much they dealt with grapes already at least 8,000 years before present. Why this should also have a preceding phase of winemaking. And this is the most interesting thing, where we totally got caught by surprise. In our first publication, report of 2007, we are talking about that the cave was inhabited, and we have these interesting traces of organic materials, very short report. Already in 2008, we started doubting our first report, and eventually we saw that in the Copper Age, actually the cave was not inhabited. It was used, but not inhabited. Because by the end of the season of 2008, we saw that there were, in all this area, there was not a single trace of household activity. We find multiple artifacts, cultural remains, different stuff from here. Not a single trace of household activities, which means you don't have hearths where to cook, you don't have any cooking pottery, you don't have any like kind of tools used in agriculture, nothing, zero, zilch. Instead, we were finding these big clay structures, all of them related to human remains. And that's when we found that this was essentially a ritual place, a cemetery. Yeah.
Wait a minute, where?
So all what you see here, all these clay structures are related to human remains.
And that's the wine
Inside.
site, though.
What? And the wine making was inside, was built inside this necropolis, inside the cemetery.
Oh my God.
Inside the cemetery. So now fewer more words about how we got, and this is about the nature of interdisciplinary research, which archaeology among all the social sciences and humanities is central to interdisciplinary research, because we have to do things like from linguistics and folklore all the way to nuclear physics, computer simulation, and work with botanicists, zoologists, practically all the gamut. Right now, more than 60 different sciences are coming together in doing archaeology. So archaeologists are like more historians and anthropological interpreters and excavators and documenters, and whereas all the practical identification is done mostly by specialists in different areas, like geologists, micromorphologists, and so on and so forth. So when we just opened the rim of that vat and started excavating the edges, we were already curious. We said, what it is, could it be? So we, as archaeologists, we first thought by ethnographic analogy, because much later, in the late Bronze Age, let's say especially in Palestine, we have 6-7 places of such places, and we have depictions in Egypt, approximately such platforms with elevated edges, and we see also there a vat in the center, and we see also people there present in Egyptian depictions, pressuring with their feet grapes. So, and also we have the same tradition preserved in Armenia, that we still have a grape collection in villages that then they collect, they put it in a big basin, and they press it with feet. And if you remember I Love Lucy, there is an episode when they are getting barefoot and getting into that concrete structure and pressure trampling all the grapes, and then the juice flows into the vat. So essentially this is a very early form of the absolutely same analogy. So we thought that, yeah, this is interesting. Probably there was some kind of pressing of something on this platform. This was one observation from ethnographic and archaeological parallels. When we excavated completely this part, and it was in a matter of days, we essentially found plenty of grape seeds around. Yes. Dried grape seeds because of these dry conditions. So our botanicist came, specialist in grapes, and she looked, analyzed, she said it's no doubt they are all cultivated grapes. Compared to the earlier 2000 earlier grape seeds that we found, but we are not sure whether they were cultivated or wild. So these all were cultivated grapes. So that's the opinion of the botanists. Then the next step, within a year and a half, we went at UCLA to our biochemists. Because the very interesting thing now in archaeology with this accelerated mass spectrometry that developed in the last 15 years, with these very powerful machines, we can study things like residues and what was on the surface of one thing or another. And besides that, we also had cups here around, drinking cups, fragments. On those fragments of drinking cups, there were sediments, residue of some kind of black organic thing. And when we did the test at UCLA on accelerated mass spectrometry, we found remains of malvidine. And malvidine is gives the red color to the red wine. So you have the technology of the vat, you have, with the pressing, you have the independent determination by archaeobotanists, and the biochemists came to confirm this conclusion. That's when we came out, we said we found the world's earliest, essentially, wine press. Now, the most interesting thing, of course, is that it was found in this context of burials. And together with the remains of human bones, we found different stuff. As I said, clothing, parts of even small weaved things like carpets that were weaved probably outside, and metallurgy. We find a whole spearhead. Found daggers, copper daggers all around. Some approximately 25 metal artifacts, more than found all in the Caucasus area altogether for that period of 4000 BC. And so the interesting thing is that they have no traces of usage, all these artifacts. And there we have the production of those things in front of the cave. So practically what we now conclude most likely that those were the service people who served the cave, the rituals inside the cave that were performed annually, and now I'm going to say a few words about those rituals, related to these burials, that were producing all these artifacts and guarding the caves, pretty much like we have also in ancient Egypt, but at a later period when in front of the big pharaonic tombs in the Valley of the Kings, we have settlements of those who protected those or served those and prayed at the priests that served those pharaonic graves in the funeral temples. We have all these pharaohs from the two Ramesses, four Tutmoseses, and so on and so forth, three Ramesses actually, in front of those tombs in the Valley of the King. Now, let's go over that. In that part, toward there, and still it goes deeper, and we didn't continue that part because there are still too many things to do with what we have already found.
How do you make the decision that when you have a hard surface like here, that you might find something in there and break it up? I mean, is it something logical that?
No, but that was exactly what my student did. He was told, dig a small stratigraphic pit to see what is underneath. So he said it's hard and it's not natural. You can see that it is not natural. The natural structure is this. So this all is artificial that we stepped on. So he starts digging this artificial layer. He hits after 5 centimeters this almost concrete hard surface, and he notices that it's also artificial, which makes it interesting. If it's not natural, then there should be something underneath. He didn't understand the first day that it was sheep dung. That was defined later by micromorphologists. But his order was to get as deep as possible to see what is inside, because we knew that there is something in the cave. So he lifted that cut with a pickaxe, this about 1 meter by 2 meters, that by the entrance. And from underneath that, this weird stuff, as he called it, started coming out. Which we essentially figured out within a month or two that it predates the early Bronze Age. We didn't have yet the carbon dates, but we knew that the early Bronze Age starts around 3200. The shapes of the pottery and other were looking earlier, so we knew that it's something earlier than 5200 years. That's all what we knew. And then in the process of the next 3 years, we have now here more than 30 samples dated with isotopic analysis, so this is the best dated and documented scientifically site in the Caucasus that we have.
So we say this is burial site.
Now, yes, now the interesting thing is, let me tell you a few words about the burials. The burials are very interestingly divided in a number of groups. So, for example, and this is the biological anthropologist who determined, Ron Pinchasi. The essentially adult male bones are mostly long bones and pieces of hips, mostly long bones of the legs, that are burnt. So they were cremated somewhere outside the cave, because there are no cremation traces here, and brought then into the cave. The second type of burials are infant burials, who are found almost complete, intact skeletons. The third kind is very interesting, women's burials. And what we found here, we found first in that part, surrounding again the wine production area, like round balls of clay. So what are in those balls of clay, this size? Started opening, and we see skulls inside. And those were skulls of young girls, about 12 to 15 years old girls. So their skulls were removed, their heads were removed. Why we know that those were not, this is another very fascinating story that tells us how it happened, and this is not yet published, because it was like found 2 years ago, about again at our UCLA lab, immediately before I moved to Armenia. So I need to follow up so that we can publish. One of the skulls contained a brain, desiccated human brain. So we took it to do a tomography of the brain, a more sophisticated version of a CT scan. And the interesting thing is, inside the brain, we found a bug. Bug. Dzor. And so this bug, actually, after the head was severed, got into the brain, and after it was all plastered in this clay, the bug suffocated inside the brain. So, and we have very beautiful photographs of that. Obviously, we need to publish also that stuff. Very, very important, because it tells us about answers a very important question. Whether, as initially Ron Pinchasi thought, that there was some kind of curation of skulls like we have from different cultures, which means that somewhere they died, then they were preserved or other things. If they were preserved, we wouldn't find an organic brain and we would never find a bug. So the bug essentially got there immediately after the heads were severed from the body and plastered. The other most beautiful, interesting thing, no, beautiful like to an archaeologist, probably to those, to most people who are not used to these rituals, it could sound horrifying. Here was a different sceneries on it. When we got inside the jar, we found what we found with no skull and completely cut the left part of a young woman's body. Left part. Very cut with bronze instruments, all with copper instruments. Only the left part of the skeleton. Where is the skull? Probably among those plastered. Where are the other parts of the body? We don't know. But it was so well preserved that it started undergoing the process of natural mummification. Because some joints were completely, even the cartilage was preserved, dried. Parts of skin and muscles were on those bones. So it was undergoing the parts of natural mummification. She was wrapped in a reed mat, and you have plenty of reeds growing along the river here besides. And besides her, next to that jar, was a burial in such a plastered structure like you saw. We had to open it completely, so that part, that structure was removed after documenting it. Was a burial of a very young child, probably only a couple of months old. And so with that child were very beautiful artifacts placed, very beautiful basket, painted in red. With red dyes, we have issues of red dyes, completely preserved. And the head of the child was preserved to the extent that even they had parts of hair on the skin, yes, through natural process of mummification. So the question is how all these things to combine together. We certainly have this external, we have differentiation by gender, we have age differentiation, how people were buried. These all things need to be still interpreted. The most interesting was, and I will finish with that, the painting on the jar, which is not yet on display at the National Museum of History, but hopefully it will be soon there, is that the jar was, you can understand it. It has the shape of an egg with a mouth. But you can understand it only if you turn it upside down. All the depictions and patterns and images on the jar are reversed. So if you turn the jar upside down, they will be all in natural order. At the bottom, or if you reverse the funerary urn, it will be the top, you see the depiction of the sun. Underneath the sun, there are rain is going, falling, there is a rainfall, with depictions of thunderbolts. So it's essentially the depiction of a storm. At the bottom, there is the depiction of fields, irrigated fields. How we know from that? There are parallel lines with dots depicting the seeds that are planted there in the field. And that's in the bottom. So there is this rainfall going there. And in the middle, in this chaos of the thunderstorm, there is a like mortal combat between a goat and a dragon. So this is a very interesting story, mythological story, on the decipherment of which I am still working right now. It is in process. But it's certainly very interesting because the fact that we have here hundreds of buried people with absolutely no remains of settlement here. Tells us that this was really this ritual cemetery with people being buried from surrounding villages or towns, wherever they are, that we have not found yet. So this is another question that we need to work on to find those villages or towns of the Copper Age where they lived around, because they did not live in the cave. And the other very interesting story, the story of wine production, looks differently from that perspective, because this wine was exclusively produced for these ritual ceremonies. Like you drink in Armenian kelech, and it says certainly when maybe we can back, come as late as the early Christianity, because you have this baking of bread outside and you have wine production inside. It's like bread and wine in Christianity. So this is the whole cycle. Now if you have any questions, we are done. Please.
This big tub or
Yeah.
whatever it is that for wine or cooking the people or what?
No cooking, no cooking, no wine, but we have human bones from most of those.
It's all burial site.
Yes.
But okay, wine production happens once a year, but humans die throughout the year. So how do you?
That's why exactly we have multiple burials of only bones. So the possible hypothesis is that the substantial part of the dead, they died somewhere. On the bones, we find the scraping of bones. Again, our paleoanthropologist, biological, he found the scrapes by metal tools. So they were defleshed. And this I'm bringing in parallel with this very, bless you, oldest traditions that we still have in the Tibet, with the defleshing of the dead up to today. So they were collecting those bones and bringing them here. The same thing is with these burnt cremated bones who were cremated outside. So you could both deflesh and cremate during the whole year and then bring them and bury here. The interesting thing is actually probably also the human sacrifices, because the girl whose brain we studied, on the back of her skull, it has a trauma hit by a club. So she was ritually most likely killed, and so we have that kind of remains here. As
Do you think the baby was related to the girl at all? Or
yes, yes,
like her daughter, whatever, maybe, you know,
yes,
not, okay.
Most likely.
And where can you go to see them? Can you go any place to see her body? And all these
Not yet,
bones now?
not yet.
None of them you can see yet.
Not yet. Probably it will take another 15 years before we process and take it. Thank you. Thank you.